Hello, welcome back to part 4 of the series, How the Church Started, which is a part of a larger series I'm doing, History of the Church and Related Questions. The last video left off talking about Paul and how he finished, how he had a great affinity for Corinth, and how Corinth really was a great place where it was strategic, where lots of people would come through. At the end of his second missionary journey, he stops in Ephesus before he heads back to Jerusalem. And then on his third missionary journey, in 52 AD, roughly 52 AD to 57 AD, this missionary journey ends up being more than 5 years long. He leaves, he goes up to Antioch, where this sort of become his base city, his home at this point. And then he goes up through the northern portions of what's modern-day Turkey and what's southern Russia today. And he goes through the province of Galatia. And he goes back and he visits some of the churches. And he comes back down and he goes across, and he's stopping in a couple cities here and there, but he goes to Ephesus. And he gets there just after a few weeks. He ends up staying in Ephesus more than 2.5 years. And this is brilliant. What he does, because he sees in Ephesus being the busiest trade port in this, on the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and probably maybe even the busiest trade port in all of the Mediterranean. Some scholars say. And so Paul, being so brilliant, so strategic, what he does is he rents out this theater, like a big movie theater, a big play theater. He rents it out. Every night he starts preaching there. He starts holding services, crusades. People start getting saved. He plants a church there. Where there had been some Christians in the area already that he actually had met the first time he was there. He actually left somebody there when somebody was traveling with him on the second missionary journey. He left him in Ephesus. So when he gets back to Ephesus, there are already some believers there. There's already some ministry going on. But he ends up starting this huge church service. Thousands of people are flocking to this thing. He was such an incredible, compelling speaker that people would flock to him. And Ephesus, people would come to Ephesus for two reasons. One was the port cities. Everyone coming from Asia Minor and the Eastern world going to the Western world would have to stop in Ephesus on the way. And so people would stay there for a night or two or several weeks at a time. People from all over the world trading, and they have different roads. So people would bring stuff on ships to Ephesus and then take roads across Asia Minor. And so it was a very, very busy city. It would have been like the New York City of its day. I mean, really, Rome would have been busy as well. But Ephesus was a trade port. It was so influential. The other thing about Ephesus was there was one of the temples to the goddess Diana, the Roman goddess Diana. She was known to the Greeks as Artemis. She was the goddess, one of the goddesses that they worshipped. I believe she was the goddess of love and sex. And people from all over the Greek world, all over Greece and different Greek city-states, and all over Macedonia and Asia Minor would come to worship this goddess. And to sacrifice to her. And so they would make these pilgrimages. People would come once a year or so. All throughout the year, people are coming to spend time to come worship. And so Paul sets up this theater right nearby, and they begin to tell people, well, you came here to worship from another city, why don't you come hear about this gospel I have? And he began to preach, and we see hundreds of thousands of people come to Christ in this 2.5 year period. Most likely is what church history tells us. People will come to Ephesus to worship Diana, to sacrifice to her, and they end up getting saved, and they go back to their hometowns, and they start telling people about Jesus. And then Paul was sending people out from Ephesus to oversee some of these new churches that were popping up all over the place because people were getting saved. And this city, Ephesus, this really becomes the launching pad for Christian. This is when Christianity had been, there were revivals. It was getting popular in pockets all over the Roman world, and mostly in the eastern portion of Asia Minor and in Jerusalem and in Israel. But it is now where you see an explosion all over the Roman Empire of Christianity, to the point where the Roman government in Rome is starting to take major notice of this incredible new religion that they seems to be. First they were like, my gosh, I thought it was just a bunch of Jewish people that, it was just this Jewish guy. But no, there are Gentiles starting to follow this guy too. And so you see a tremendous amount of people go from here. Some Bible scholars say that the church in Rome was started by someone that got saved in Ephesus. There are several other cities in Asia. There are cities that Paul actually wrote some letters to that are in the New Testament that he actually had never visited, but there were people in Ephesus that got saved, and that he raised them up, mentored them, and trained them, and then sent them off to different portions to start these churches. And a lot of these guys started churches. And so Paul because Paul was their apostle, and he was the bishop to oversee those churches, he had the authority to write, challenge them in issues and encourage them and to teach them, write them letters. And so Paul does this. Eventually, after Ephesus, tremendous ministry, he leaves, goes back over to Greece, goes back to some of the places he'd already been, visits a few more cities, and ends up going back down to Corinth again, spends several months there. This is like home for Paul, second home. He loves these people. These are probably some of his dearest friends. And by this point, several of them get wind of what was going on in Ephesus, and the Corinthian church starts sending money all over the world to helping poor Christians and helping poor people and helping Christians spread the gospel, and using their money to send out missionaries. It's a great story. If you ever have time, do a study on the Church of Corinth. It's phenomenal. Peter Wagner actually has a book on the Corinthian church that I would highly recommend. So he spends several months there. He ends up going back up through Greece and back up to Philippi and back down into Troy and back over through Ephesus. He doesn't stop in Ephesus because there's people really mad at him, because a lot of the guys because of the temple to Artemis, to Diana was there, a lot of the guys would sell trinkets and trophies and statues and different things that they could sacrifice in the temple. Well, a lot of these guys that were selling like trophies they went out of business. Because everyone was getting saved, they stopped buying stuff from these vendors that were selling trophies of the goddess Diana. And this is actually not only recorded in the book of Acts, this is also recorded by several Roman historians, like Tychius and Flavius Josephus actually also mentions this. And so this is well documented in church in world history. So there was death threats in Ephesus, so he doesn't stop in Ephesus, but he sort of stops nearby, and some friends of his come by and come meet him. And all throughout this time period, when he's stopping, he's writing letters to churches. When he was in Corinth, he wrote a letter to the Galatians, and he wrote a letter to the Ephesians. He's writing letters as he travels around. On this third missionary journey, he's writing all these letters, and then eventually he goes back to Jerusalem, and he gets imprisoned there. He's imprisoned there for several years. He's beaten. He's flogged by the Jews. The Jews hate him for preaching about Jesus, and he is thrown in prison. He's imprisoned there for a couple of years, and then eventually he asks for an appeal. He was a Roman citizen because of his dad's position. He was a Roman citizen. Not every person who lived in Rome in the Roman Empire was a Roman citizen. Only Roman citizens had special treatment, got special they had special rights. And so Paul, as a Roman citizen, he goes to Rome looking for an appeal of the conviction to be overturned. And and there are multiple times throughout the book of Acts where you see Paul boldly proclaiming the gospel all throughout the known world, and he becomes a celebrity, so to speak, and he plants all these churches, and he's the one that really sets up the system of bishops, where there's a church raising up elders, training them, and then there's bishops all throughout the world. Eventually he goes to Rome. He's imprisoned there, and eventually he's executed. Some say it was 64 or 65 AD. Some say it was 68 AD. Somewhere around that time period, he is beheaded after being imprisoned in a disgusting jail cell for several years. And it is there where, when Paul is in Rome, he writes many letters to many different Christians. Some are in the Bible, some are not in Scripture, in the New Testament. But he writes several letters, and he encourages many of the believers. And it is there where the church in Rome begins to really grow. And the church in Rome begins to, there are the Jews actually been exiled from Rome up until 60 AD. So a lot of the Jewish Christians came from Asia Minor back to Rome after the exile was over. A lot of them were Christians at this point. So the church at Rome explodes in popularity, in growth. There's incredible persecution. Christians are being thrown into the Colosseum, being eaten alive by lions. One Roman Empire uses them as torches, rather than using lights in his garden at nighttime. He's tying Christians up to a post. He's tying them up and he's lighting them on fire and using them as torches. There's a brutal, violent martyrdom, violent, destructive persecution going on. But the church explodes in growth, and Paul the Apostle was the one who set the example. He's the one that motivated the Christians in the first century to lay down their life and do whatever it takes to spread the gospel, and they certainly followed his lead.